Good morning, evening, or afternoon to those of you following this channel. Today with you, Victor Telles. This channel is Cristero Moderno, coming to you with more about the Word of God. Today we're going to start looking at the book of Daniel. Um, every 3 weeks we're going to be looking at a new chapter. Uh, the other days in between, we're going to be looking at other parts of the Bible, as well as church and Jewish history and so on. Having said this, it is important to understand that the book of Daniel was written between the year 586 BC to 530 something, 30 odd BC. We know this because of the names of the kings mentioned. Now, uh, during this time, uh, Jerusalem had been conquered by Babylonia, and all the members of the upper class of Israel were taken to be prisoners and to be trained to serve in the palace of the king, as the chapter itself will let us know. In order for this to happen, the king had to re educate the citizens that he had kidnapped. And to do this, he wanted to eliminate any connections to their to their native language and their native cultures. So it also involved teaching them Aramaic, which was the language of Babylon, in a failed attempt to make them forget about their culture. This is where Aramaic comes in. So we find that the book of Daniel was written in a particular form where it is um, mixing Hebrew with Aramaic. When languages come together, they clash. Um, there's a lot of people in a lot of Hispanic people here in Latin America, right here in the United States, have developed a language where they mix English and Spanish, and so on. When cultures collide, language evolves, and that's what we notice has happened. As when we look at the actual Hebrew text for Daniel, we see a lot of Aramaic words in there. Now, the Daniel's name in Hebrew means judgment of God, and as I already mentioned, it takes place. It begins with the conquest of Jerusalem, and it goes on even past the fall of Babylon to Persia. Today, let's just focus on the first chapter. Based on the context, we can conclude that at this time Daniel is somewhere between the ages of 18 and 22. Now, having said this, let's begin. Let's dive right into the reading. I will be reading from the Douay Rhymes Bible. Go ahead and follow along. All right, here we go. In the third year of the reign of Joachim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. This is the year 586 BC, roughly about 1600, 2600 years ago. And the Lord delivered it into his hands, Joachim, king of Judah, and part of the vessels of the house of God, and he carried them away into the land of Sennaar to the house of his God, and the vessels he brought into the treasure house of his God. Now, the land of Sennaar is what today we would call the northern half of Iraq. especially between the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, it's talking here about Nebuchadnezzar um, takes this, invades Jerusalem, and notice he takes the instruments that were from the house of God, the house of Yahweh, the temple in Jerusalem. He takes the sacred vessels. Now, since they were at the temple, they were sacred. That's why they're sacred. Excuse the redundancy. And he takes them to them. Since they're sacred, he takes them over to the house of his God. In other words, in the temple of Marduk. In The chief god in Babylonia was Marduk. Although they also served Baal, their main god was Marduk, the god of the storms and the god of war. This means that Nebuchadnezzar was trying to consecrate once again everything that had belonged to God already. He's trying to reconsecrate it, taking things away from God and consecrating them to his pagan gods as the way of, number one, praising his the idol that he worships. Number two, claiming superiority of his idols over God, according to him, of course. We know that the reverse is actually true. And number three, um, trying to get these people whom he has taken to abandon all ties with their roots and with their God, the God of Israel. He spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring in some of the children of Israel and of the king's seed of the princess. Children, we would normally think about being young children, very small ones. But the actual word that appears in the Hebrew here is na'ar, ne'arim, which is more like a teenager. So this is kind of like they're bringing pretty much teenagers to re-educate them. In whom there was no blemish, well favored and skillful in all wisdom, acute in knowledge and instructed in science, as such as might stand in the king's palace, that he might teach them the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Now, we see here the characteristics. He had to choose from, first of all, he is taken, as we see at the beginning, from among the princes, from among the most important people of Jerusalem, from among the higher classes. Once he has them, they investigate who are the ones who are okay without blemish. That means they're not talking about physical blemishes. They're talking about health. Those who were not sickly, well favored. Now that right there, they're talking about the physical appearance. So they had to be handsome, perfect health. It says skillful in all wisdom. In other words, they would have to be smart. Curing knowledge, they should have plenty of knowledge about things, and instructed in science. Science, of course, does not mean to the science in today's terms. In biblical terms, the word science was dot, which means really to just be knowledgeable of things in general. What the Bible calls science in today's form of speech, it would be defined as general knowledge, not having a scientific mind. That's that's completely different. Such as might stand in the king's palace. The word stand here, in Hebrew there are two ways to refer to stand, and they have different implications. There's the word hakum, which means to be physically standing. That's not the word that's right here. Right here in the Hebrew, it tells us that they could amad. Amad means that they could be not. not only physically standing, but also ready to serve. That's generally what they're talking about here. That these people could be trained to properly be ready to serve the interests of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And we will see that teaching you that they're trying to teach them the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans, which is what? Aramaic. They're trying to teach them Aramaic culture. And the king appointed them a daily provision of his own meat, and of the wine of which he drank himself, that being nourished 3 years afterwards, they might stand before the king. So they are to go through a preparation of 3 years, get ready, get trained, and then upon their graduation, they would be officials of the court. Now there were among them among the youth of Judah, Daniel, Ananias, Mishael, and Azarias. In the Bible, names are important. Daniel, the name of a prophet, means in Hebrew, notice they are Hebrew names. Daniel in Hebrew means judgment of God, or my God. I think, yeah. Ananias, Hananiah comes from Hananiah, which means grace of Yahweh, favored by Yahweh. Mishael means who could be like God. In other words, kind of like asking who dares to be similar to God. And Azariah, which in Hebrew means God, my help is God. My help is Yahweh. Notice all four of these names give honor to Yahweh, the real God, the God of the Israelites. But let's see what happens next. The master of the eunuchs gave them names. So we have the master of the eunuchs, the person in charge of keeping an eye over all these youth. He changes their name to Daniel Balthasar. So um, our very prophet, whose name is Judgment of God, or my judgment is God, he is renamed Balthasar, which means consecrated to Baal. You see, the pagan and Babylonians are trying to redo everything, trying to give them new identities so that they would renounce their identities as belonging to God. The names that these four youth have, they are called theophoric names. In other words, names that give witness of God's existence, that give praise to God. But since the Babylonians don't want them to be connected to the God of Israel at all, now they're being renamed so as to eliminate any mark connecting them to God, and giving them names that would give them a connection with the idols that the Babylonian worship, such as Baal. We see Ananias, which means uh, um, favored by God. His name to Sidrach, which means follower of Aku. Aku was god of the full moon, god of wisdom to the Babylonians. Mishael, which means who is like unto God. Now he is being renamed as Mishach, which means who is like unto Aku. You notice that the reference um, to God is trying to be eliminated by these Babylonians. Azariah, my help is God. is renamed Abdenago, which means servant of Nago, the Babylonian god of light. So they were all references to their names in Hebrew, which and connections to the God of Israel were eliminated, or so that Babylonians thought, and renamed to connect to the pagan gods. But God had something else in mind for these Jew, Jewish youths. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not be defiled with the king's table, nor with the wine which he drank. So now you notice this. Daniel refuses to be defiled. He mentions about the table and with the drink, but notice that they were renamed to connect to pagan gods, trying to like get them to renounce to God. But they chose to be faithful. They chose to be faithful to the real God. So for them, these four names that they were reassigned falls off. They abandoned these names, the new names they were given, and they decide to continue going by the names by their Jewish names. Only the Babylonians will be calling them by their new names, while everybody else goes by their names that were given to them by their own parents when their Jewish names. Now we saw earlier that the king had chosen to give these people, these youths who were getting prepared from the choicest foods by the king. Whatever the king ate, these youths would eat too. Now, Jews, as part of the religion, they have very strict dietary laws, which is called the halach. It requires that they eat certain foods, and they have to be the animals that they eat have to have certain characteristics found in Leviticus 11, and they have to be prepared a certain way. For example, if we were to go to a fancy restaurant and they would serve this juicy lobster tail, for most people it would be wow, such a delicacy, or however you pronounce it. Wow, what expense they spent for this. But then again, to the Jews, lobster was forbidden. Yeah, and it still is. So they would be like, oh, what kind of trash are they giving us? So whereas the common folk would be saying, wow, this is great food. For Jews who follow the halach, the strict dietary laws, they would be like, this is trash. Um, Roasted pork. Wow, a lot of people would say, how tasty, roasted pork. Yet then these Jews who follow the halach, the dietary laws, they would say, this is trash. So they do not be contaminated by food that does not follow the halach. Babylonians do not have dietary laws like the Jews do. So that's why it tells us that Daniel does not want to be contaminated by the king's table nor by his wine. Who knows what the origins of this wine are? Sometimes what they served the king was also food that had previously been offered up to the idols. One day they give the food to Marduk, and the very same food that was given to Marduk was then picked up the next day, given to the king and to these youth people, to these children who are being retrained. Let's call it from now on Nebuchadnezzar's school. Now, verse 9. God gave to Daniel grace and mercy in the sight of the prince of the eunuchs. In other words, Daniel's personality was such that the prince of the eunuchs, the man in charge of Nebuchadnezzar's school, liked liked him. So he was willing to help Daniel whenever his job allowed him. Daniel was, okay, or we could say that the king of the eunuchs, the man in charge of Nebuchadnezzar's school, found Daniel likable. And the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed you meat and drink, who if he should see your faces leaner than those of the other youths, your equals, you shall endanger my head to the king. You see, Daniel told this king of the eunuchs, I don't want to eat this crap. In essence, that's what he told, what Daniel and his friend told the guy in charge of the Nebuchadnezzar's school. We don't want this crap. Then the person in charge, the principal, so to speak, the prince of the eunuchs, tells Daniel, well, I have to give you this. Otherwise, I'm in trouble if you guys are not well fed. If you guys go up and he sees that any of you are malnourished, it's my head on the line. Now, Daniel proposes something which I like to call the first scientific experiment of all. Of course, there's no talk about the modern concept of science in the Bible, but the so-called scientific method of making an experiment in which you have a control group and a variable group, and then see the results. Well, the first one to ever do this was the prince, uh, or not the prince, but the prophet Daniel. He gives, he proposes an experiment. Let's see what it is. And Daniel said to Melazar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had appointed over Daniel, Aeneas, Misal, and Azarias, try, I beseech you, your servant for 10 days, and let pulse be given us to eat and water to drink. Pulse here refers to vegetables and plain water. In other words, he says he does not know where the meat that was being served in Nebuchadnezzar's school, he does not know where that meat came from. He does not know if it's pork meat, which they're not allowed to eat, beef, or chicken, or some other strange animal, as some places were known to do. He does not know the way these animals were killed off. Even that is important in the dietary laws. For a Jew to be able to eat uh, beef, for example, that the cow had to be killed in a very special procedure so as to provide the least amount of pain to the animal and lead to the most bleeding of it possible, so as when they eat, they do not accidentally consume the blood of the animal. If the animal was killed any other way that is not by that procedure, then even if it's from a pure animal, that animal was defiled for being killed in a wrong in the with the wrong procedure, and then therefore it would not be halal. They have no way of knowing how the animal was killed, so they don't know if the animal is kashar or not. They don't know then if if these animals fit with the Jewish requirements of halach, in other words, ritually pure nourishment. That's why they refuse to eat the meats. But nobody offers vegetables to their gods. So Daniel's like, well, just give us vegetables. For all practical purposes, we can say that Daniel just has just to eat salad. Keep in mind, Daniel is not talking about being a vegan or a vegetarian. There are people, vegans and vegetarians, who use this to their advantage. Daniel refuses the meat just because he does not know where this meat is coming from. And he does not want to accidentally offend God due to the dietary requirements that they, as Jews, have to observe. Now, verse 13. Look upon our faces and the faces of the youth that eat of the king's meat, and as you shall see, deal with your servants. In other words, David says, give me and my people, that's his three friends, David, Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael, to give those four people just salads and water, just to put it in our modern terms. And then after 10 days, they were to be compared to the rest of the youth who do eat of the meat that is offered by the king. In other words, what is healthier, the Babylonian diet or the or salads? That's the experiment. Which is healthier? And then Daniel tells them at the end of 10 days, if we are not, if you see that we are not, excuse me, if you see that we're not as healthy as the other youth, then do with us what you want. We'll go ahead and eat anything else after that. When he heard these words, he tried them for 10 days, and after 10 days, their faces appeared fairer and fatter than other children that ate of the king's meat. After 10 days, when the trial period was over, they noticed that this experiment was a success. Those youth who ate the vegetables, salads, and water were healthier than the ones who participated with other stuff that the king gave them. So Manasseh took their portions and one that they should drink, and he gave them vegetables. Post means vegetables. Remember, the Dway Rhymes Bible was put together in the 16th century, so it uses some 16th century vocabulary. To these children, God gave knowledge and understanding in every book and wisdom. But Daniel, but to Daniel, the understanding also of all vision and dreams. So these youth who were trained in that school, they learned everything they were to learn about Babylonian culture and language. But Daniel was to be God's link so that the people of Israel were not to forget God. So he chooses from among them Daniel to be his prophet, his representative among the people among these youth who were captive in Babylon. When the days were ended after which the king had ordered they should be brought in, the principal eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. So now 3 years are over. Daniel and his friends graduate from Nebuchadnezzar's school and they come forth in front of Nebuchadnezzar. It's time for them to get their new jobs as servants of the court. When the king had spoken to them, there were found among them all such as Daniel, Ananias, and Mishael, and Azarias, and they stood in the king's presence. So among all the graduates of Nebuchadnezzar's school, these four stood out: Daniel, Ananias, Mishael, and Azariah. The four who chose to avoid eating the king's food and decided just to stick to vegetables, salads, speaking today's terms, and water. In all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the diviners, wise men that were in all his kingdom. before this time, before this time, Nebuchadnezzar depended a lot on the advice given to him by his witches, magicians, and diviners. However, at this point, Daniel is now making a name for himself. With the wisdom that he gets from God, he's able to satisfy the needs of the king when he needs advice. And the last verse tells us Daniel continued even to the first year of King Cyrus. Now, among Protestant thinking, they tend to interpret certain phrases wrong, even to the first year of kingdom or unto the first year of King Cyrus. Protestant thinking seems to conclude, based on certain other topics unrelated to this, but whenever they see this phrase, even to or until, oh, that means up to that point and then no more. But that's not what it means here. It means that it includes every single thing here. In other words, Daniel did not just serve under Nebuchadnezzar. King Cyrus is the king who comes in and overthrows Babylon. King Cyrus is the king of the Persians, who in the year 539, that 50 years later, overthrows the Babylonian Empire. This is telling us that even though the king Nebuchadnezzar died, Daniel was still there counseling the Babylonian kings. That even half a century later, when Babylon falls to the Persians, this Daniel was still being the advisor. Let me show you something. Let's look at this. Nebuchadnezzar. Here we see his name right here. Now let's look down here. Where is it? Sometimes I just have a list of sequence here. Nebuchadnezzar ruled Babylon from the year 605 BC. That is from the time um, um, what word am I looking for? From the time in which when from the time of King Josiah, his king during the time of all five of Josiah's children, and then some. So in 586 BC, he's still being king. However, he's king of Babylon until the year 562 BC, when he is succeeded by Amel Marduk, who, okay, Daniel was the advisor of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now Nebuchadnezzar is dead. Guess what? Now Amel Marduk is king. But who's Amel Marduk's advisor? You guessed it, Daniel the prophet again. Amel Marduk dies in 560. Nergalizar comes to power. Who's Nergalizar's advisor? Daniel the prophet. Nergalizar dies. And we have Labashi Marduk rise to power. Who is his advisor? King David. Our prophet Daniel. Daniel's still the advisor for King Labashi Marduk. He dies. Nabonidus comes to power in the year. Let me see down here. In the year 556, Nabonidus rises to power. It does us get to 526. To 539. But history tells us there are 7 years missing from this kingdom, from 546. So Nabonidus lasted 7 years, um, well, 10 years, Nevertheless, lasted from 556 to 546. At 546, he takes a pilgrimage and leaves it in the hands of his son Belshazzar, who in the year 539 dies. Why does and notice there's no mention of another one? Because what happens 539? Persian conquest. And who led this Persian conquest? Well, that was Cyrus, who was mentioned here earlier. Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, kills Belshazzar, taking over and destroying the Babylonian kingdom in 539 BC. Who was the advisor during all this time? Daniel the prophet. But as we will see in chapters that come about, we will find out also that even during this time, even after the fall of Babylon, when the Persian kings come about, they choose to keep Daniel still as their counselor, as their advisor. We will find that later on that many Persian kings, after the fall of Babylon, were still choosing Daniel as their advisor, as their counselor. Meaning that the word "until" does not mean that that the influence of Daniel stopped then. It continued. But it's telling us what is this verse trying to tell us? It's telling us that Daniel was advisor not only to Nebuchadnezzar, but to other Babylonian kings, and later to the Persian kings. As always, may God's name be glorified. Long live Christ the King!